Welcome to the Politics People. Joining us today is a political commentator, journalist, author, contributor to the New Statesman, Tribune and Novara Media. She's also a regular on things like Good Morning Britain, The Andrew Marr Show, Question Time. Talking to Grace Blakeley. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
All right, so look, the tenuous conceit of this show is my theory is that the commentators have had more influence on policy in the last decade than elected politicians. Are you aware of any influence that you've had on politics?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, we all like to think that we've had perhaps more influence than we have, but I can certainly think of some ways in which I've influenced the debate and ways in which that's kind of gone on to change policy. So, as you may know, a lot of the work that I do is around finance and financialization, which is basically kind of a process whereby different areas of the economy, from household spending to business investment, becomes subject to the logic of finance. And I've kind of helped develop a series of proposals at the Institute of Public Policy Research, which is where I used to work. Looking at how we can kind of control the influence of finance over the rest of the economy. And a lot of that thinking did go into things like the Labour manifestos in 2017 and 2019. And, I think the broader kind of narrative that work has been a part of, which is that, we need to have an economy that's focused on productive long-term investments, that is aimed towards, not just creating jobs, but also making economic activity more sustainable. I think that has actually potentially influenced even, Conservative party policy, in the sense that we are far away now from the days of austerity, when, George Osborne and others were saying, right, we've been through this crisis, we've got to seriously cut spending. I don't think that many people think that same level of cuts is likely in the wake of this crisis, because there seems to be this new consensus that investment and long-term sustainable green investment is really important. So I like to think I've contributed to that in some ways, whether that's through my policy work or through, going on TV and shouting about it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. You're maybe 40, 50 years ago, you'd have been like a one nation Tory, really, with that kind of... Because that's where the Tory party used to be in the 70s. It was very similar kind of outlook.
Yeah, I actually write about this a bit in my book, where I talk about how the common sense on a lot of areas of the economy has changed so radically over the last 40 years. Because you're right, between the 60s and the 70s, there was this general consensus that, for example, the unions were broadly like a positive force in that they worked with businesses in the state to keep wages up, that long-term investment was needed, that the state should intervene in the economy when there's crises. And then it was in the 80s where that was just completely smashed, and you had this emergence of this new kind of way of organizing the economy. That's what I refer to in my work as finance-led growth, that came out in the 80s and obviously, collapsed in 2008. And I think we're now going through a process of rethinking what the kind of values are that we want to be at the center of the economy that we're designing for ourselves.
So what informed that instinct that you have for that approach to economics and politics? Did you grow up in a particularly political household? Were you informed by any kind of circumstances?
Yeah, it's funny because, obviously, I'm, middle class white girl from Hampshire. So you wouldn't necessarily expect basically Marxist economics to be looking at the world. But it was really my granddad who was the person in our family that probably had the most impact on me. He left school at 14, went to join the Merchant Navy, and when he was away, read the Communist Manifesto, came back and got really involved in the Labour movement. He was a shop steward in the TGWU and learned a lot about, socialism and all these different things. And kind of passed that on to my mum, who was also quite political, and onto me, obviously, directly and indirectly through her. So I've always had these sorts of values in my upbringing. We've always been very focused on, I've always been learned about inequality, global inequality, exploitation, all these sorts of things. But I think it was really my own education that led me to kind of go down the specific route that I've chosen. It was through learning basically about the way that capitalism works and all the kind of many crises and inefficiencies it generates. And to be honest, I feel like if I had kind of, been to university before the financial crisis, things probably would have been very, very different. But it's, studying political economy in the wake of that massive meltdown, it really encourages you to think quite critically about, the proselytizing work of all these liberal economists who say capitalism is the best thing in the world. I think that's really been challenged recently, and you're encouraged to kind of see the problems that exist within the system rather than just thinking, oh yeah, this is the way it's got to be.
Yeah, it's interesting with you because you are you're actively part of the UK Labour movement. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's my reading of you, that you're immersed. But coming up to the 2019 December election was probably the most significant watershed in the recent Labour Party history, and they had this basically. You have these views, and this is why I wanted to talk to you, but you are one of the Labour Eurosceptics. Your view on economics is it's interesting because you're kind of, you're practically Trumpian anti-globalist with your approach. How did that go? I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm just saying it's just like there aren't many avowed Labour supporters coming out of 2019 who were anti-EU. Well, how did that go down with your colleagues?
Not well. But again, I think what's interesting is that there is a very, very long history of Euroscepticism within the Labour Party. And
Completely.
in fact, most socialists, like Tony Benn and Michael Foot, who were very sceptical about European integration. It's only really been for the last kind of 30-ish years, 20, 30 years, when, European integration has become a synonym for tolerance and inclusion, that the left kind of got on board with that. And I think that's been part of a broader process whereby the Labour Party in particular has stopped really focusing on talking about the economy and has increasingly decided, right, we just want to build a fairer society, which is good and was a good thing that happened, from the kind of the 90s onwards. But it was only really under Corbyn and to a lesser extent Miliband, but mainly under Corbyn, the Labour Party started really talking about the structural economic issues again. And it's on that basis that my views about Europe come. So, I wouldn't say I was a Trumpian globalist because I'm very much in favor of the free movement of people, I'm not one of those kind of blue Labour people who has kind of quite culturally reactionary views and thinks, we should be clamping down on crime and all those sorts of things. That's, not really my wheelhouse, to be honest, but my instincts are very much towards the kind of more progressive end. But when it comes to economics, there are very strong reasons from the perspective of socialist political economy to be very skeptical about the European Union. So firstly, of course, if you're in the EU, you have to have complete and utter openness to capital flows, to financial flows, which can really distort the way that your economy works and can also, if you look at the way that financial globalization has changed the global economy, for example, you see that it has led to basically kind of really extreme exploitation of particularly weaker states that don't have the power to control the movement of capital in and out of their economies. So they see lots of inflows followed by lots of outflows, which is exactly what we're seeing at the moment, and has actually, made those issues of inequality between different countries worse. So it's not from the perspective of kind of nationalism and saying, we need to shut down all our borders and protect people here at the expense of people there. It's actually saying, in order to build a fairer and juster global economy, we need to have different rules than the ones that are enforced by institutions like the European Union, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. in recent years, rather than a kind of nationalist backlash against kind of progressive social policy.
I just find it really fascinating because I'm a horrible, horrible right-winger, and it's like everybody comes on the show, they're just like aghast. But apart from the environmental beliefs, my motives, my personal motives and my kind of solutions are very similar to yours. It's just interesting that, and this is what I see with the left, I think that Trump and a Ben, a Tony Benn, I think his kind of approach to his skepticism about that, global economics. And it's just interesting that there are a lot of bedfellows aligned. We saw it with the referendum, the EU referendum. You had people like Claire Fox sharing stages with Nigel Farage, for instance, and you'd think that they would not be politically aligned. But I think you articulate the skepticism of the left towards the EU very well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would put more distance between like my own views and those of people like Trump and Farage, because to be honest, I think that the motivation for these people for resisting globalization is not, to build a fairer, juster society. It's kind of in order to deepen the pre-existing divisions between different groups of people, right? And that is not something that I support in any way, shape, or form. But I do think it's interesting that one of the reasons why perhaps working class people who voted to leave the European Union, but who have quite left-wing views economically, probably much more left-wing views economically than someone like Trump or Farage, did so was because they recognize that, in some instinctive way, they recognize that power has been taken away from them in a process of the centralization of political and economic power amongst a small elite. And that is something, interestingly enough, that some people on the right do agree with those on the left about. So, those on the left come from that perspective and say, capitalism has become increasingly centralized, financialized. It has all these problems. We need to, kind of move beyond this system in order to solve them. I've spoken to lots of people on the right who actually say, we don't live in capitalism anymore. We live in a kind of corrupt capitalism cartel capitalism.
Exactly. That's where I come from. We live in corporatism. We live in corporatism now. And that the EU was easier to parcel up to the corporations. So you had unaccounted power in the EU Commission being able to be sold off to international global corporations without the checks and balances that you might have had in the US or in certain versions of the UK. But exactly, that's where they meet up. That's where those interests are aligned.
Yeah, and I think the real key issue there is democracy. So, for me, a lot of the questions that I think the left should be talking about today are questions of democratic power and of making sure that people have power over their lives. So that means decentralizing the state. It means giving more power to local authorities, local communities. It means decentralizing the economy. So having, supporting the emergence of kind of, cooperative firms, like worker ownership and workers on boards, changes to corporate governance, and alongside that, kind of pushing for the democratization of various aspects of the state. So, getting rid of the House of Lords or like democratizing the Bank of England or any of those sorts of things. So for me, like, socialism today, especially within the Labour Party, so where you've got socialism that's oriented towards like electoral politics, it should really be about those questions of democracy, about making sure that we are developing a narrative which says that, we believe that working people, when they come together, can develop the solutions to the problems that we face and, like create a better, more harmonious and equal system than the one we have now. We should be returning power to them rather than either letting corporations rule over them or doing what the left sometimes does, which is say, give us your vote and we'll give you everything you want ourselves. I don't think that works over the long term. It's too paternalistic. I think we need to be saying, let's give power back to people.
And look, in everything you're saying, it does chime with, that's the direction the Labour Party nearly went when it nearly had Tony Benn as leader. I was always impressed with it. I think everybody in politics was impressed with him because he was just so resolutely a Democrat. I mean, that was his... Yeah. But do you not think that Labour in recent years kind of lost that and became... through trying to, like I said, I never question any of these leaders' motives, actually, Trump, Farage, or even Corbyn or anybody. I think actually everybody's in it to do good myself. That's my naive approach. But the Labour sort of lost that kind of connection with democracy, with accountability, with the representation of those of the grassroots. That's how it played to me. And I think that's why you ended up with so many conservative gains in the north of England. It's like they're not traditionally Tories, but they wanted somebody to actually represent their actual vote, as opposed to just be a block kind of support for some sort of EU mandate.
Yeah, I think that was definitely a big part of the issue. It was, and this is always going to be a problem, which is that the biggest contingent of kind of support for the transformation of the system comes amongst younger people. They're the ones that are really radically involved in trying to change things. And often, it's not the case that all the young people are in cities, but they're most concentrated in cities. So it means that you get this kind of centralization of power and of influence in the major cities. And that doesn't work in the electoral system that we have, because it means you've got all these really excited, enthusiastic activists in London, and they are increasingly involved in policy making. They've got the close links to the politicians, and it means that they, often the leaders just aren't hearing what's going on in the rest of the country. I mean, like, I remember before the election, I went on a kind of bus tour of Leave seats in the north with a couple of different people, and it was just very eye-opening to hear people's experiences of saying all of these things that they felt left out of the decisions that were being made on their behalf, of seeing the impact that our economic model has had on these communities, and of, I suppose, seeing a different kind of experience of the Corbyn movement, if you want to call it that, which was far less kind of organized and radical. That is really, and historically, the links to those communities were provided by the union movement, by the labour movement. And obviously today it's a shadow of its former self. So I think really kind of rebuilding the labour movement is going to be a really important challenge for the left, actually, both if you're thinking about economic concerns like the fact that we've had a decade of wage stagnation, or if you're thinking about broader politics.
Was that particularly, when you were on that bus, touring the country, was that a particularly frustrating time for you? Because it must have been that if you could see that with your own two eyes, you could see how it was being received on the doorstep, and the campaign was resolutely sticking to this kind of compromise position. Was that very frustrating for somebody in your position?
I would be lying if I said it wasn't frustrating. And I did not, as time went on, I got more tired and frustrated. I became increasingly bad at hiding that frustration.
Really?
Which kind of exploded on several occasions. I mean, obviously, you are in an election campaign and you are focused on the thing that you are working towards. And I did, even up until about, I don't know, a couple of weeks before the election, think, we might have a chance. But it was on that bus tour that I realised actually that that the Labour was going to lose. And that was a very frustrating experience. But in many ways, there are so many reasons why this revival of the left was based on relatively weak foundations, because it occurred after such a long time of anyone with kind of even vaguely left-wing views being, especially on the economy, being kind of out in the wilderness. And suddenly everyone kind of tries to come back together in the wake of the financial crisis. And I just don't think there were the kind of institutional foundations there to give it the staying power that it needed. I think really that's the task we have now, is to try and build up those foundations so that, the left is not just about, getting control of the Labour Party, but there's actually a coherent source of left-wing socialist opinions in wider society as well. Which is also something that was missing, I think, before the last couple of years. So like someone like me would never really have been on TV 10, 15 years ago, because my views just wouldn't have been represented. So, yeah, I think, that sort of stuff will continue to change. And I think we need to be there to support that. But, yeah, it was obviously frustrating losing that election because of that position after fighting against it for so long.
Yeah, you just and again, sorry, this is not. I genuinely am trying to find out more about how the individuals I'm talking to function within all these things. I'm just really fascinated by obviously the sausage making of politics. It's just fascinating. So, but you touched on that. You wouldn't have been on TV. Somebody like you wouldn't have been on TV 15 years ago. What was the catalyst that got you? Because you became, you are a very recognisable face on political shows in the UK. So what was the watershed? What was the thing that catapulted you into that world of punditry?
Well, I mean, partly, so I got a bit of early experience working for IPPR, the Institute of Public Policy Research, where I did policy. But what really kind of kicked it off was I did this this media training program run by the New Economic Organisers Network. Basically, they kind of train like progressive voices. So it's not associated with any particular political party. It's just, people who talk about the environment, about economics, whatever. And they give them media training, and then they put them in touch with producers. I did that and did a couple of media appearances. And after that, it just kind of kicked off. So I did a few. And then it's once you make a splash. I think the first splash I made was basically when I was on This Week with Andrew Neil talking about austerity. I did a kind of particularly explosive remark about, if doing austerity is like failing to feed your kids and failing to pay your rent, and then looking back in 10 years and being like, oh, well, the kids are dead, but at least we paid off our debt. And that kind of made a bit of a splash, and it was written up in some various papers. And after that, it just kind of becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. People see you on TV and they say, oh, do you want to come on my show? And yeah, then, I was doing Politics Live, then Question Time with Jacob Rees-Mogg had to be a highlight of those early appearances. It was very funny. I think it has, partly because of coronavirus and not being able to do stuff, it has slowed down a bit since then. I think partly also because these things come in flows, right? Sometimes you are in the center of the spotlight and sometimes people are thinking about something else. But it's been an amazing, if occasionally incredibly stressful journey.
I can only imagine. What was what's the career path now if somebody, because again, I'm flogging this dead horse, but you wouldn't have been on 15 years ago. That's how you arrived on the scene. And like I said, there's a lot of people popping up who wouldn't have had a platform. This is the thing. People, people like you and Farage are all products of the new democracy on the internet. It's just like, this is the kind of the paradox with all this. It's just the unelected politicians or unelected commentators are having all this influence. But what does somebody do? Like you were alluding to, right? Next, we've got to do this. What are the next stages for you? How are you going to roll up your sleeves now for your movement, your beliefs, whatever is the next stage for you? What's the actual meat and potatoes? What do you do? It's not leafleting anymore, is it?
Yeah, no, it's not. It's definitely not leafleting anymore. I'm still very organised. Very engaged in organising within the Labour Party. So, I did last week, for example, I did a Zoom event with a group of activists every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Like I'm doing those. If it wasn't for the pandemic, I would be doing in-person events at least 3 or 4 times a week in various different constituencies throughout the country. And that's like, as you said, rolling up the sleeves and doing the work of kind of political education and organising and talking to people. None of that's paid. So in terms of my actual work, it's working for Tribune, which is this left publication that has been revived recently. Obviously, it goes back to the time of it goes back to the 30s. So yeah, I'm working for them. I'm also doing a lot of other writing, including a new book. I've actually got 2 other books coming out this year. One is a pamphlet about the coronavirus crisis, and another one is a collection of essays that I edited called Futures of Socialism, which is asking all these questions about what do we do next. Then obviously I'm still doing a bit of media and other, I get asked to do like various bits of writing and speaking engagements and all those sorts of things. So I'm managing to keep myself busy. But it is one of those things where, you have a platform and you kind of assemble a portfolio career, don't you? You pick up bits and pieces that you want to do, and you have to learn when to say yes and when to say no. It's definitely not a kind of rigid path forward.
No, yeah, you got to stay flexible. Absolutely. I mean, surely you're running for office. I mean, what I'm trying to get is that you must be. I mean, look, your position as being, we come 4.5 years time when you come to the next election to win back those northern constituencies that voted Conservative. They're going to have to put in people who are overtly Eurosceptic, because one of the bogeymen that will be hung over the Labour Party is it's like, look, they're going to take us back in. It'll be, we'll only be freshly out. It's going to need people like you who were overtly Eurosceptic before the referendum and before the 2019 election. Surely you're running for office.
I haven't ruled it out, but we'll have to wait and see, because obviously I don't imagine, particularly in the good books of the current administration, I don't know. And there's a process that has to take place within the party. So I wouldn't write it off. And I have been speaking to people about potentially doing that. And, it is something that I would probably like to do over the long term, because you've got to put your money where your mouth is at some point, don't you? But there is a question of feasibility and about whether or not I'll be allowed to stand with my extreme views.
That really surprises me, because I would have thought that they would want to distance themselves as much as possible. I mean, Keir Starmer's already said that he's got no intention of taking the Labour government or taking the country back into the EU after this. I mean, overtly, it is done and dusted now by the look of it from Labour Party point of view. It's for the voters. Like I said, it's got to be somebody that you can't point to in a constituency and say, look what she was saying before the election. And that, I would have thought that you're a shoo-in.
Well, a lot of the time it's small p politics. People want to bring people in who are their allies. But I'll probably give it a go. So we'll see what happens. If I don't get it, then either it'll be because I wasn't good enough or because I didn't have enough friends in the right places. I'll let others decide.
No, they're lucky to have you. They're lucky to have you. What's interesting? I'll let you go back to your real life in a second, I promise. What's interesting? I was impressed by how much you're prepared to. Look, I talk to lots of people on this now, and I've been amazed that there are people with sort of high profiles and political positions, etc. Basically careers, and they've been prepared to talk to me and be very open. And you fit into that. I'm amazed by the number of people who are just Tupney Halfpenny kind of, but interesting. Don't get me wrong. How difficult some people are to actually get on a platform of any kind. I don't know where that fear comes from or where that skepticism comes from, but it's very difficult to book some people. It's very difficult to talk to some people. From what I can see about you, you're pretty much prepared to talk to anybody and
anyone.
And be very. That sounds awful. I don't mean it like that. I mean of any political stripe. You don't. You are unchanged. Your demeanour doesn't change depending on who you're talking to, and I think that's a great quality. Again, I think that's a very inclusive quality that you have.
Yeah, I suppose because, I don't see, I suppose a fairly similar way to you, I don't see the big differences between people of different political persuasions as differences of personalities. I don't see it as, like the good people versus the bad people. I see it predominantly as, a combination of values and actually basic material interests. I think there's often a reason why people who come from particular backgrounds support particular sets of policies, right? I don't think that makes them bad people. I don't think it makes, the rest of us good people. I just think we have different ways of understanding the world. And it is important to reach out to and talk to and understand people whose perspectives are different from you, because you are going to come across those people in different, walks of life and in different contexts. You need to be able to make arguments and talk about things, as you say, honestly, and in a way that resonates with people. I do think you're right, actually, though. That point about being honest and open and authentic is really the big thing. But I think often it can be difficult to do that, because when you're being authentic on TV, you're putting yourself on the line, and people are going to be nasty to you. So it takes a while to be able to get used to that and to, I suppose, let your defenses kind of come down a bit and realize that, it's not about you. If you can just be yourself, then either people will like it or they won't.
And what about towards you? Did you lose any friends over... I've been in the States now for like 12, 13 years. I still vote in the UK for another couple of years, but it was really territorial. It was really tribal, I think, my perception of the EU referendum. Did you lose any friends from the position you took, the stance that you had?
Like, I wasn't really particularly involved in the referendum, to be honest. Like, I mean, I obviously took a skeptical position at the time, but I wasn't very vocal because I wasn't really in the spotlight at that point. It was only afterwards that I started making these arguments, because that was when I was actually, I'm 26 now, so it was when I was about 24 that I actually started getting a public platform. And, people certainly were curious as to why I was taking that position. And some people outright dismissed me and even said that they hated me for taking that particular position on Europe, which is, fine. Again, I don't think that that's about me at all. It says, if you say I hate someone for thinking this, you are saying something about yourself. You're not saying something about the person. So ultimately, I learned to deal with it. And, I would say that these people have now obviously realised that they were wrong, but mostly they haven't. So
no, they haven't.
What can you do?
It hasn't. The penny hasn't dropped yet. And just again, this is pure gossip, basically. But have you got any mates that you don't have to name them, but that people would be surprised that you're friends with?
So people that I've been on TV that I've gotten along really well with, who are of different political persuasions than me. So I get on really well, funnily enough, with Fraser Nelson. I think he's a really lovely man. Tim Montgomery, I really like. Piers Morgan, I've actually had some nice interactions with. Ian Dale, even though we've had this big, tiff, I actually get on with all these people really well.
I talked to him last week, and yes, there's a clip that's worth getting. Ian Dale, Grace Blakeley, and it was what's his name, Nihal, wasn't it?
Yeah.
From Radio 1. Yeah, it's worth Googling that. Ian Dale walks off Good Morning. I was on his side on that one, because I was talking to him last week and he hadn't heard, or he hadn't remembered. He says, "Oh, well, I just won't talk then." And Nihal says to him, "It's not you. I thought your manners were impeccable." But Nihal, under his breath to Ian Dale, says, "Oh, good, go on then." All right. And if you watch the clip, I can understand somebody going, "Oh, just okay, I'll go then." If you're going to say that, So I thought it was quite fun, but it's a good clip.
I don't prejudge people who have, the reactions that they have on TV, because it's a very high pressure situation, and anything can happen. And like Ian and I didn't fall out over it. Like, I mean, we did a bit, but we made up very quickly. So yeah,
he was very sweet about you.
Endorse his latest book.
Oh, good. Well, there you go. That's it's all been forgotten then. That's great. No, he was lovely as well. I loved him. He was fantastic.
Yeah,
but isn't it is just, I mean, you're in the thick of it, and I don't mean the reference to the TV show. You're actually in amongst it all. But massive politics is being played out actually in TV studios, actually on Question Time, actually even on Any Questions to some extent some weeks. And I've never seen that in British politics before, where actual power was being it wasn't just that kind of New Labour showroom smell. It was actual hustings were happening live in front of your face for the very first time in my lifetime. Anyway, it must be really exciting to be in amongst all that.
Yeah, it is. And, I feel very, very lucky, more than anything, to have been able to kind of come up at the time that I've come up, and to, meet all the people that I've been able to meet. It's been a pretty wild ride, but, it's not over yet.
It's not over yet. No, I'm going to let you go back to your wild ride. It's this will have been the least exciting thing that's happened to you in a few years, talking to me, but
Hardly.
I'll draw it to a close, and like I said, let you get back to. Let's face it, you're going to be running the country at some point, aren't you? It's just
you
like
and my mum are the only two people that think that.
Yeah, well, she's a very, very smart woman. That's all I'm saying. Listen, Grace Blakeley, thank you so much for your time today. I'm so grateful to you, and it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.